Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors legal hotline lawyer, and today we are once again reaching into the Washington Realtors legal hotline mailbag to answer your questions. Seller is agreeing to do a second mortgage on a sale. Buyer has asked the seller not to record the second for 6 months to allow the first mortgage company time to sell off the paper on the secondary market. If seller complies, is seller participating in mortgage fraud? Pause. Yes, unequivocally yes. And so are the brokers participating in the transaction. The mortgage fraud actually occurs at the moment that the lender, we're going to talk about the word lender in a minute, that the lender is misled about the fact that the second mortgage actually exists, or the second deed of trust actually exists. Now you might say, no, the lender is fully aware, because it was the mortgage broker who suggested this. Actually, the way the question often reads is, the lender suggested that the deed of trust be recorded 6 months after recording of the loan. And I absolutely guarantee that is not what happened. What happened is that the mortgage broker, or maybe even an employee of the bank, recommended that the deed of trust not be recorded for 6 months after closing. Why would they make that recommendation? Because it is the lender's objective, and the lender is not the mortgage broker and not the bank employee. The lender is the entity that actually puts the money on the closing table, the one who takes all of the risk as to whether or not buyer is going to repay the funds. The mortgage broker doesn't take that risk. The bank employee doesn't take that risk. The bank or the funding entity takes that risk. That's the entity who has the right to know what the actual terms of this agreement are. And if that entity, the actual lender's purpose in making the loan, is in part to be able to sell that loan on the secondary market, and having a second deed of trust recorded against the property would invalidate that lender's ability to resell the property on the secondary market, then I guarantee you that the lender doesn't in fact know and isn't in fact encouraging that second deed of trust to be recorded 6 months after closing. In fact, that lender knows nothing about the second deed of trust. So creating a second deed of trust is necessarily fraud on the lender, because we have this huge fact in the transaction that we are concealing from the lender. Here, lender, here's what you believe the facts of this transaction to be, but what you don't know is that the buyer actually owes the seller an additional sum of money established through the obligation of a promissory note and a deed of trust that's not recorded against title of the property but will be later. That is lender fraud. Beyond lender fraud, from the listing broker's standpoint in this transaction, it would be gross negligence on the listing broker's part. Why? Because the seller is relying on the promissory note and the unrecorded deed of trust to collect some portion of the value of this property from the buyer. What if in those 6 months, before the deed of trust gets recorded, because the deed of trust should be a second position deed of trust, what if in that 6 month time period, the buyer goes out and borrows money from some other third party who records a deed of trust or some evidence of the owing of debt against title to that property? Maybe it's a judgment lien. Maybe the judgment lien attaches the instant that the transaction is recorded. Then seller, 6 months later, when they record their deed of trust, is now in third or fourth or fifth position on title, depending on how many other things have already attached to title. Or what if buyer doesn't make a single payment to the first lender, and the first lender starts foreclosure proceedings, and the deed of trust, the seller's deed of trust isn't recorded yet. Seller never even gets notice of the foreclosure proceeding. By the time seller records their deed of trust, the property's either been foreclosed or it's in foreclosure proceedings, and the seller has no claim whatsoever. No notice of the foreclosure proceedings and no ability to intervene. We are in a very busy seller marketplace. And what we saw leading up to during the 2004, 5, 6 busy seller marketplace is lots and lots of folks who are trying to find ingenious ways to get sellers' property sold, often by committing lender fraud. Brokers, it's not always as obvious as the facts in this question presented it. You have got to keep your radar up for situations where mortgage brokers, bank employees, buyers, sellers, escrow folks encourage you to participate in a scheme where the facts presented to the real lender, the underwriter, are different than the actual facts of the transaction. In this situation where a deed of trust is being recorded 6 months after closing, red flag. If somebody describes handling something outside of escrow, or they don't often use the terms under the table anymore, but it's the same concept where we're going to make payments under the table as opposed to across the closing table where it's in open light for all, including the lender, to see. In other words, any element of a transaction that's concealed from the lender being the entity that actually puts the funds at risk in the transaction, that's loan fraud, lender fraud. And to the extent you are involved in lender fraud, you're committing a Class B felony. It's really not something you want to play around with. It's a very serious issue. And leading up to the 2007-2008 market crash, the federal government and the state law enforcement agencies were actively pursuing brokers who were involved in loan fraud. I suspect that if loan fraud catches another tailwind like it did back in the mid-2000s, the law enforcement agencies are going to be right back in action enforcing. I suspect that the law enforcement agencies are going to be right back in action pursuing claims against brokers as they were in the mid-2000s. So please be careful with this issue. Just be aware of what you're being asked to do. If you aren't sure whether or not something constitutes loan fraud, go talk to your managing broker. If you still can't tell, send me an email. I'll help you figure it out very quickly. Legal hotline at warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtors member.